Hello everyone. Welcome to the second episode around Intune policy. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how a policy is applied on a device and how that might impact what you see in the console. So first, before we get into Intune policy, let's talk a little bit about the concepts that Intune policy uses to set an inventory policy on a device. So we use something called configuration service providers, or CSPs. And these CSPs typically have two sort of avenues of utilization. The first one is something called a config node. Now this has read and write access on this node, and this is where we write configurations, and the OS expects us to write configurations. The OS keeps track of these configurations based on the provider that set them, so Intune would be a provider, or any MDM would be a provider. And then the features enforce the settings from these providers, in order of who won, right? And since there's only one MDM allowed per device, typically, there's only a single provider that quote unquote wins. Secondly, some CSPs support results. And what this result is it's a get operation that basically tells you when you provide a configuration, which provider won, right? So which configuration is the active configuration on a device. So for this, we're going to focus mostly on config, because config is what we use to get the configuration currently set on the device and to set configurations that need to be set on a device, right, for Intune. Now, there's sort of three operations that happen when a device checks in with Intune, okay? The first operation that happens is an initial inventory, right? So this initial inventory tells me, hey, what's the current configuration being set on the device, and should the setting that I need to apply to the device, should that be set in a following task? The next task is to sort of remediate, right? So, hey, I've looked at the configurations that I'm supposed to apply. I figured out which ones apply, and I'm going to set those configurations. So based on that, you should be able to tell that the first inventory task is where we determine applicable, not applicable. So this is where your applicability status generally gets generated from. And then the next one is where my setting status starts to come into play, most notably error. So if I see error in the console, it's usually in this second step when I go to remediate the setting. When I send the setting to the device, the CSP essentially says, hey, this is the value. It tries to set the value based on OS parameters that it has, and that can either be successful, return 200. This is all done in HTTP status codes, right? Or there could be some sort of error, a non-200 status code. These status codes are then sent back to the service, and then the service can determine if it was successful or not. We do handle some non-200 status codes as success, but those are few and far in between compared to the roughly 17,000 I think settings that are supported right now. So if all this is successful, then we go to the inventory task, right? So after we remediate, we want to make sure that the value we set was successfully set, right? This very rarely results in an error, right? But it can. So, odd things can happen from time to time where, I set a configuration and then I go back to make sure that it's set and it's no longer there, right? So these are the sort of three steps of policy application in Intune. The one that's most notably sort of omitted here is how node cache plays into this whole thing. I can probably do a 40-minute session on how node cache works, but essentially what you need to know about node cache is it's a caching mechanism that's tracked between client and service side that allows some optimization here, right? These premises still hold true, okay? So once we look at this, you might be asking yourself, how do I determine the applicability for a general setting, right? So if I go to the CSP documentation, you'll see that I have different sort of applicabilities per setting based on edition and based on the OS that's supported. So those really give me my applicability aspects and the applicability side of the house here. So with that being said, this is a high-level overview of how Intune policy works and how it's applied. And maybe in a future session, depending on the interest, we'll cover how conflicts can happen, how we do conflict resolution in Intune, and the different types, and also maybe some data around where we want to go in the future from a conflict resolution perspective. So I hope this session was useful. As always, leave some feedback, and I'm always happy to take suggestions for future sessions. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.